I'm pleased to be joined today by Dr. Dorsa Amir. She is a psychologist and anthropologist and currently a postdoctoral research fellow at UC Berkeley. Her research explores the diversity of human behavior and decision-making from a cross-cultural developmental perspective. Dorsa, welcome to the Nature and Nurture podcast.
Thanks for having me.
We were talking off camera about how you're kind of at the intersection between these two fields. Psychology is kind of obvious, and that's what most of this podcast covers. What about anthropology? Could you introduce that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So anthropology, I mean, the term comes from anthro, which means human, and pology, which is the study of. So it's the study of humans, which is pretty broad, right?
And then it's like, I thought that was psychology.
Yeah, exactly. So psychology is the study of the human mind, the psyche. Anthropology is a bit broader than that. And just to give you kind of a primer on anthropology, there are four subfields. So there's sociocultural anthropology, there's linguistic anthropology, there's archaeology, and there's biological anthropology. So there are different ways basically to think about what it means to be human. Essentially. And my background is in biological anthropology, which is using kind of this perspective of evolutionary biology to think about the human species, how it's evolved, and how it functions. And so my training is in that. And within that, this perspective I found very powerful for thinking also about how the mind varies and how behavior varies across all these distinct cultures that, the human species is very uniquely displaying. And so my research interests, my personal interests really lie at the intersection of, how we think about the human mind and how that varies across cultures.
And you're also a developmentalist studying children. Is that typically understudied in anthropology?
Actually, yes, I will say. And even in psychology, I will share, it is understudied. I actually did this little review of what percentage of PhDs are going to the different subfields of psychology. And pretty consistently, developmental psychology is like less than 5% actually of the PhDs that come out. And so even in psychology, but also in anthropology, especially historically, there's been, I think, generally a blind spot when it comes to thinking about children, which is actually really such a shame because human childhood is extremely unique. And I would argue it's like, everyone has their pet theory for why humans are so successful. Like, oh, it's because we could run, or like, oh, it's because we have language or whatever. Yes, to all of those. But also we have this incredibly rich and long period of development that we don't share with any of the other primates. Childhood is pretty much unique to humans, actually. And it's a really special period of time where you're really absorbing all of this just like incredibly rich and complex cultural, social, linguistic information, figuring out where you are in the world, what's going on there, who are the people around you, and really figuring out these specific skill sets for, existing in this really complicated world. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really one of the secret ingredients to human success, and I think it's vastly underappreciated.
Me too. I'm very surprised it's such a minority. Maybe I'm biased because I'm a developmentalist myself, and because we're talking about nature nurture, right? Which is like the key question in developmental psych. Yeah. So, childhood being unique to humans, that seems like a very radical claim. I'm not saying I disagree with it.
Yeah. Well, so childhood here I'm defining as a special extended period of development. And it is, in fact, if you look at the life history stages of other primates, it's not that other primates or mammals don't have dependence. They are dependent on their parents for some amount of time, but usually that is a much smaller period of time. So they're like breastfeeding for a while, they're weaned, there's perhaps a period of adolescence, and then they kind of become subadults and they start spreading out, for instance, to different groups. But humans have this special period, which is really interesting also because around this time, what's happening is you get this massive decrease in somatic growth, meaning your body stops growing at such a rapid pace. And all of a sudden you get this huge influx of energy going to brain development. So there's this really kind of unique trajectory that humans go through that, again, we're not seeing in any other of these species, where it's just like this focused period of time for cognitive development. And of course, this is where you and I come in terms of our interests, like, whoa, what's going on during that period? This is so cool. Like, there had to be some, I think, strong selection to be able to stabilize this kind of window. And also, I mean, think about the structures around you that exist to facilitate that, right? You need to be able to be dependent for long periods of time. You need to have a lot of parents and caretakers investing in you during that time, because it actually takes quite a long time for kids to be able to be what we call net positive foragers. So like you're basically a sinkhole for energy and time for a while until you can really start producing things on your own. And that takes quite a long time. So it really, a lot of things have kind of aligned to give you this period of learning, which I think is really, really cool.
So one of the main theories for why we evolved our intelligence is social pressure, right? Because in terms of the basic survival necessities, like getting enough food, every animal that survives like over the test of time is getting enough food, presumably, and they can pass on their genes and so on, but they do it with much less intelligence.
Yeah. So I would say one of the more prevailing theories is this idea of complexity. So in terms of foraging complexity. And interestingly, you can actually see this with primates as well. So if the thing that you're targeting is a bit complicated to reach, right? So it's not just like bamboo that's growing on the ground or whatever. It involves, let's say, like tracking and hunting down prey, which is what humans often do. That actually requires quite a lot of cognitive ability. And you do see, even I think spider monkeys also display this. So depending on the type of thing that you're targeting, the complexity of actually achieving that resource, that does seem to be correlated with things like intelligence and brain size as well.
And I guess at the opposite extreme, I read somewhere, I don't know if it's true, that sloths will eat their, I think, eucalyptus leaves, but if you take them off the tree and put them on a plate, they won't recognize it.
Yeah, they're not going to do well if you do that to them, I imagine.
Okay, so on somewhere along our evolutionary history, we go from foraging to hunting, and we get smarter, we get more energy from meat, and then later cooking develops, and we start to develop culture. This is all like a massive oversimplification, so let me know how I'm doing.
Everything's yeah, it's all good so far.
Okay, so and then what keeps us going from there? Like at this point, does the natural selection sort of not come to a halt, but like does cultural selection take over?
Yeah, so I mean, it depends on who you ask. What I would say, at least my view, is that you're always going to have culture gene coevolution, right? So it's not that natural selection ever goes away. Even now, we are subject to it. But it's possible that we can kind of weaken the force of selection through various cultural mechanisms. And so all of these things that you're describing, I think the other thing that's going on, obviously, is this kind of massive increase in things like our language abilities, social networks and relationships, and cultural information and knowledge. And all of those things are coalescing into kind of this, what people would call, this additional line of inheritance that you have. In addition to genes, you have cultural inheritance. And they are all kind of evolving with each other, right? So the things that you're practicing, the way in which you're living your life is affecting your relationship with the environment, and it's affecting the force of selection. So I think all of those things are going on and kind of building on each other. There's this ratchet effect, especially with cultural evolution too.
So I suppose that might be one reason why historically childhood was understudied, because historically childhood mortality rate was much higher, right? So it's almost like if you don't pass that initial barrier, you're never going to get to the whole surviving and reproducing thing anyway. So I guess it's just like you're considering the population at which selection is actually acting upon to be the adult population that's eligible to reproduce. But at the same time, you could flip that around and say, if there's some traits that allow you to survive childhood better, those would be even stronger predictors than like traits that allow you to survive better as an adult.
That's right. So actually, I mean, everything prior to reproduction is being acted upon, right? Because you got to make it to the point where you can actually reproduce. A couple notes that just various thoughts are coming up based on what you said. Number one is this idea of the childhood mortality rate. So yes, it is true that there were really high rates of mortality. And in fact, in many places in the world, this is still true. A lot of those are affecting children under the age of 2. That's where it's mostly concentrated. But it still is relatively high until you get to, like 8, 9, 10 years old where it starts dropping off. But once you make it past this pretty strong selection event, actually, your chances of making it to adulthood are probably more than you would imagine, right? So once you make it past, when people say, for instance, that the average, the lifespan is like 32, nothing's happening at 32, right? It's that there's a big, huge mortality wave at the beginning of life, and obviously everyone dies at the end. Those average out to like 30 or whatever. And what we've done, I mean, I think rather wonderfully over time, is really decreased infant and childhood mortality rates across time, and we're continuing to do so in a lot of places. Now, what that means in terms of like the force of selection, I think, again, anything prior to reproduction, you're going to have selection acting on that, right? Because you have to make it through to that selection point.
There's something I read recently that was very surprising to me, because when we think about an infant dying, it seems like this massive tragedy. It was some anthropology paper, it might have been yours, that mentioned that in certain cultures, children aren't seen as like humans until they reach a certain age. Maybe it was like 2 or older. And that if they die before that, it's like, it allows you to not grieve as much, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, so, I mean, really, you have to think back and consider just how much mortality was prevalent in the everyday lives of people, right? Yeah. So, I mean, infant mortality and childhood mortality rates are as high as like 30 to 50%, even now in some of the societies in our world. There are, I mean, I push back against this claim that like maybe you weren't as connected to your child. I do think, parental bonds especially are really kind of deep, intimate bonds that have always been very strong. But I take your point that, there have been kind of these cultural mechanisms to maybe try to put a little bit of distance so that you can better kind of tolerate that horrible loss. And in fact, some of these still happen today. So christenings, for instance, are after a certain period of time, or I know that in the Jewish tradition, there's like a name day ceremony after which a name is given to a child once some amount of time has passed. And yeah, there are definitely several societies where they actually have a lot of like cultural and religious beliefs about the humanness of an infant, right? They like think that there is this pre-human form, essentially. In other words, that, an infant is kind of still in the spirit world, so to speak, and then they kind of come into being after some amount of time. Now, yeah, as an ultimate kind of perspective, you can maybe see why those things would help you just psychologically potentially protect against how awful it must be to lose your child, which unfortunately happened all the time. Yeah. But I don't, I do push back that the bond itself was weaker. I don't know. I don't think so. I think people were just really just experiencing a lot of hardship and a lot of trauma for an unbelievably long amount of time, basically until recently. The norm was that you should just kind of expect that to happen,
Right. So this relates to things like PTSD or brain changes in response to adversity. To what extent are those, like we typically consider it as if you have your normal healthy brain, and then these are changes, bad changes that in response to stress. But our evolutionary history is very stressful. We encounter threat all the time. So presumably those are adaptive changes.
Yeah. So, as we were talking about a bit before, me and Willem Frankhouse recently wrote a review paper on this exact topic, which is that a lot of the research that we do is biased toward our own lives, right? Like our understanding of the world is deeply influenced by our experience with it. And a lot of the people writing these papers, a lot of the people influencing the field of, psychology have been raised in relatively stable, well-resourced, American Western households, that kind of thing. And so it's easy to think like, okay, that's the norm, and the baseline, the default is the safe, nurturing environment that's really kind of, well-resourced, and there's all sorts of input, and it's loving and it's warm, and, anything that falls short of that is an adversity, and you're kind of breaking away and dysregulating from the expected environment. And we challenge that view a bit. So I want to be clear that I don't think that adversity is good, and I don't think that it has, that it doesn't have negative consequences, right? Like it is true that the trauma causes negative consequences, and those things are valid. I don't want to discount that at all. I just push back against this question of what is the default state? What is the expected environment? And what are we falling short of? Because as you just mentioned, throughout human history, there's been a tremendous amount of adversity, really, tremendous amount of mortality, a lot of threat. And it's not to say it was all bad, of course, right? It wasn't like a miserable hellhole. Like it was there's obviously positive aspects to thinking back in time, but it was definitely a tough place to grow up and a tough place to live. Mm-hmm. And the idea that like the expected environment is one that is just like safe and nurturing, I don't know if we have really the grounds to make that argument. Right. And of course, the amount to which these inputs varied is tremendous. Like there's so much diversity in the types of experiences that people have. And this is the main point we make in the paper, really, is that evolution has probably pushed toward high levels of what we call phenotypic plasticity. So this means the range of possible expressions there are of your genes. There's been a tremendous amount of plasticity built into the human system because there's so much that you can't quite anticipate and can't quite prepare for. There's such a wide range of experiences, just from the temperature you're going to experience every day, to the type of food you're going to eat, to the type of social network you're in, to the type of marriage system your community has. Like all of these things vary, and you can't really come in with strong expectations for these things. Because if you're, raised in the Arctic versus the Amazon versus the Sahara, like those are completely different worlds, really. Mm-hmm. And the plasticity to be able to adjust to whatever those experiences may be, again, I think is one of these kind of key ingredients for human success, because that plasticity allowed us to adapt to these widely, widely different environments. And this is another, I think, cool case of human uniqueness. When you have organisms that spread out to all these widely different environments, they do so by speciating. They just become different species. There's like a specific type of jungle ant that lives in the Ugandan jungle, right? Mm-hmm. But humans don't do this. We're all one species, right? So think about just the amount of flexibility and adaptability that has to be in our cognitive systems to allow us to accommodate like just unbelievably different life ways.
Right. This is related to that protracted period of human development, right? The more plasticity you have, the longer the developmental period has to be in order to adapt to that.
That's right. And the more diversity there are in the type of inputs that you might be facing, the more adjustability you need to have to respond to that, right? And the more time you need to try and figure out, okay, what's going on here where I'm born? What are the things we do? What's the language we speak? What's the food that we're targeting? I mean, those are all like unbelievably complicated and unique things to that environment. So it's this interesting balance of being like specific but broad at the same time, if that makes sense.
So in anthropology, it seems like you have to try and remain quite neutral. Like even though we have less adversity now, you don't necessarily say that's better.
No, I'm willing to say that's better. I think less adversity is good. And I think the main point really is just like we should question our assumptions that the environment that I as a researcher grew up in is the environment that I think is the gold standard against which everyone else should be measured against, right? And especially if I'm trying to form hypotheses about things like the consequences of various experiences, like you really need to have a broader perspective about what those experiences could be and what we are equipped to deal with.
Okay, I wasn't sure if going into these anthropological questions, if I was allowed to use these moral terms, but with that out of the way, so some things have improved, right? Like we have more food now, probably not going to go outside and get eaten by a predator. Like all of these things make it much safer and easier to live. But on the other hand, so this is related to that evolutionary mismatch idea. There are some things that are much worse, like our diets are worse than what we adapted to. We're less socially connected than we used to be. All of these things, I guess you could argue about, but I think you know where I'm going with this. So could we talk about pros and cons of what's shifted between like then and now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just say, so the process that you're describing is largely linked to industrialization, right? So you get this subsistence change from, let's say, foraging and growing garden crops and fishing to now, like here we are talking on our computer, and I sometimes go to Safeway and I use currency to translate it into, like, it's just a crazy system that we've created. definitely there are pros, right? We are living in the safest, healthiest environment. I mean, really, like in terms of a child being born into any world at any time, I've like won the human lottery, right? Like my child has been born into the safest, most medically advanced, like it's a lottery ticket that's just like hitting the jackpot, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think really, and I think that is not to be discounted. Like there are so many people born today that are living healthy lives, and that just would not have been an option for them. So that is, I think, something to be thankful of. Of course, there are things that have come about as a result of this that possibly may be detrimental. So I think, when we think about our social networks, for instance, and me, I'm a first-time parent. I have an 18-month-old, and a lot of these are really hitting home for me now because I'm like, wow, it would be so nice to have people around me who can allo parent and help take care of my child. Like it's so hard as like two adults to take care of one child with very little family and friend support in the way that I see, for instance, among the Schwarr families that I work with, where there's like a ton of other kids, your cousin's living next door, your aunt's over here, your dad's over there, like everyone's kind of pitching in a way that we can't quite do here.
And that was
I
closer to normal throughout our human history?
Definitely. I mean, certainly living in these small to medium-sized groups near family is the standard model, so to speak. Who you actually lived with varied quite a lot, of course. So you have all these different types of marriage systems where sometimes women marry into the men's family, they move away. But often, more often than not, if you're a child being born into one of these societies, you're going to be surrounded by people that are recurring faces that are likely related to you. And I think that type of social support is really, again, the third key to success that I'll bring up today, right? This ability to rely on people who are not directly even related to your child, or not, the mother, which is typically what happens in mammal societies. And that actually has allowed humans to do all these really impressive things, like have really actually quite a lot of fertility and very short, what we call interbirth intervals. So you can have the average interbirth interval in a lot of these populations is something like 2 years, which is remarkably quick, actually. So you can really have quite a lot of kids, and there's quite a lot of support for you as well. And that is a system that I think is pretty common along most of these societies, and probably was the prototypical, style in the past as well. And I think, the problem, I think, is there is, I think, we have an ability to have, I think, a really healthy and successful life in the environment that we have. But there are some paths that are easier to go down sometimes that might not be the best for us, right? So it's really easy, for instance, to just like just have high calorie food all the time. Like it's available to me in a way that has never been available in the past. And it requires a lot of like conscious thinking and decision making on my part to potentially decide not to do that. There, in terms of like, I mean, there's just so many domains in which we have I think, some things are a little bit out of whack, in my opinion, that probably could be improved upon.
Do you study delayed gratification in children at all?
I do.
Can we talk about that?
Yeah, let's talk about that. So I have done work on what are known as time preferences. So how many things you value today versus tomorrow. And the kind of classic example of this is the marshmallow task, right? So I put a marshmallow in front of you and I say, okay, if you wait 10 minutes, I can give you another marshmallow. And the idea, it's interesting. So these were really pioneering works by Walter Mischel and colleagues in the 60s and 70s. And I think when it really grabbed the public consciousness was when they were able to track some of these kids longitudinally who either, quote unquote, passed the marshmallow task in early life, whether they were able to wait for the second marshmallow, and then you saw what happened later on in life. And you see all these like potentially positive outcomes, like kids who were able to delay gratification had like higher SAT scores, for instance. This view, I think, at least publicly, to Walter Mischel's credit, he's never really claimed that this is true, but the general understanding of it was that, these kids have like self-control, like there's something there's something that they have that carries through, and the delay of gratification is able to be applied to all these different domains, and this is why they're so successful later. And I and other people have really pushed back against this claim because I don't think that's quite right. So, and I think this goes back to this idea of like researchers kind of using their own life and experience as a measuring stick. And then like, if you fall short of that, there's some deficit, right? Mm-hmm. So you just have to really think about the context in which our decisions are taking place in. So if I, let's say, take $10 today versus $20 tomorrow, you might think, wow, like you really couldn't delay gratification. But you really have to think about, what does that $10 mean to me today? And actually, maybe in the environment where I live in, where let's say I'm in a very turbulent environment or a very resource poor environment, or there's a lot of harshness in my environment. Actually, it's the more rational option, honestly, would probably be taking $10 today, right? As opposed to $20 tomorrow, because tomorrow is not guaranteed. Why would I take on that risk? And I think the contextualization of these decisions within the larger environment is something that we don't do enough because we're so quick to dole out these judgments, like impatience is bad and it's, not virtuous and it's something we should avoid. And, I think there's a lot of, the context is really missing in that.
So that the more stable your environment is, the more likely you are to delay gratification. Is that due to within stable environments, people are more likely to be taught to look towards the future? Or is it like an automatic natural thing and people just do it based on what their personal experience is?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So it's almost certainly both. So this is the kind of interesting and frustrating thing about studying humans is that we have culture. And so it's not just us with the environment making decisions based on what we personally experience, but we are embedded within all these larger cultural networks at the level of family, the community, the country, et cetera. There is work with non-human animals showing similar patterns, though. So it's not necessarily resource levels and access to resources do help determine things like time preferences. So if I had, let's say, $1,000 in my account, waiting till tomorrow to get $10, actually not that big of a deal. Like, I can buffer it quite well because it's relatively worth less to me. And this is something that's the time preference angle of it is found pretty consistently, especially in relation to income. So there's a BBS article by Pepper and Nettle, which outlines this really nicely, and how this kind of time preference shift really makes sense in these other environments, and how, viewing it through the lens of what Willem Frankenhaus sometimes has referred to as adaptive peaks, right? So it's not that like one is necessarily superior to the other. It's not Mount Everest versus another mountain, but really there's just other ways to resolve the issues in your environment. And they can't quite be compared the same way, right? They all have to be considered within the context.
One prediction there, if you grow up in a country like ours where there's surplus of food all the time, is that you would be super good at never giving in to those impulsive desires because there's going to be enough food tomorrow. But we're really not that good at it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Well, a lot of those preferences actually are also linked to things like income and socioeconomic status. And this is, again, I think, nicely outlined in Pepper and Nettle's article. There are competing demands, right? Like, I would love to be super patient, but, I really do want this cupcake right now. And it's really hard to deny myself that. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. But yeah, there are competing motivations.
How does this work out cross-culturally?
Yeah, so this is some of the work that I've done. And, something that I was really curious about was how something like industrialization might be changing these things, right? So we just talked about how industrialization really shifts a lot of variables, right? So now instead of getting food directly from the environment, now I'm like going to work, I'm waiting 2 weeks to get paid through a currency that's fungible, and I turn it into something that I want, and then I can turn it into food. Like, it's such an indirect and weird way to get to the end. And it fundamentally, I think, requires some amount of patience, actually.
Mhm.
So one of the things I really wanted to look at was how this industrialization process might be changing or shifting, or at least associated with different patterns of behavior. And so what I did was take basically a version of the marshmallow task, and I took a version of this risk preference task. So do you want this safer option, or do you want to kind of take on a gamble, take on some risk for potentially a bigger option? And I worked with kids in 4 different countries to try and assess, okay, is there something going on here? Are we seeing similar patterns everywhere, or are there some differences that maybe we can try and predict systematically? And what I find is that industrialization does seem to be associated with more present orientation. So, quote unquote, industrialization is linked with more future orientation. My apologies. So basically, you get more quote unquote patience in these more industrialized societies, and you get a bit more risk tolerance. I'm saying everything backwards. I'm sorry. Industrialization, risk seeking, future oriented. This is what we find. And I actually did what I think was an interesting natural experiment, which is that what we wanted to do is look at how the presence of markets, just the presence of markets, might be influencing these things, because there's so many things that can influence these preferences. And so we exploited this natural experiment that has happened within some of the Shuar communities that we work with in Ecuador. So there are Shuar communities all across this region that we work with. And approximately like 20 years ago, Ecuador and its government decided to pave this national highway that cut through some of that territory. And over the kind of the years that followed, this market access really increased with communities that were near the roads, right? You have cars coming in, trucks coming in. You can now have really more efficient trade with other parts of the country. You get people coming in that are from different cultural groups. And so you start really integrating more into this kind of global economy. And so what we did was we compared people living in those communities near the markets, and we compared their behavior to people living down the river, like a day's trip away into the forest, who were not really quite so near the markets. And what we find are these really interesting, and as we predicted, different patterns in risk and time preferences, where the kids that were living near the markets show more future orientation and they show more risk-seeking behavior than kids living deeper in the forests. And so here, I mean, of course, there are many other factors involved, but here now you have something like a natural experiment where it's as close as we can get to, two groups of people who are very similar in many different ways, and one of them just kind of gets assigned to markets and the other one doesn't. And so through these types of experiments, we can try and tease apart what are some of the factors that might be influencing some of these preferences.
What are some of those factors? So there's surplus of resources, and I guess there's sort of more of a safety net. Is there anything else?
Yeah, so those are the 2 that I've been following most up on. So this idea that you have resource access increasing and how that might embolden you to behave in a way that you wouldn't otherwise. And I think that's a very intuitive idea, and that comes up across a lot of different domains of literature, actually, this idea that when you have more of something, you can buffer costs better. Now, there's many different things that could be influencing this, right? And I think if you break down, this famous weird acronym, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, you can go into either one of those and plausibly come up with a relationship between that thing and the preferences that we're interested in, right? So maybe you're introduced to more Western cultural customs. Maybe it's something about formal education, because the quality of schools might differ. Maybe it's about industrialization more broadly and how your labor is translated into various units that you need. Maybe it's about resource richness, which is kind of what I've been pulling at, or maybe it's something about the political and social organization changing. And in fact, you do find, these risk and time preferences aren't the only things that really seem to be shifting. So I have some other work that we're working on now, looking at social preferences among kids in these environments and across cultures. And what you find are also changing social norms. So this idea that you should, share more with an anonymous stranger, like that really comes online and starts strengthening when you have these communities that are more industrialized, right? So the typical social interaction that's happening varies quite a lot. when you start integrating into a global economy, and that has these downstream consequences for our preferences for other people, how we behave socially, and so on.
So if you're in an isolated community, strangers are kind of unheard of and it's like stranger danger. But if you're in a very globalized society, you're kind of used to interacting with strangers.
Yeah, I would say that at least in these less industrialized communities, you have a preference for sharing with people that you know. So that's kind of what we're finding, is that the cooperative partner is not just anyone. It's usually someone that you're related to or someone that you know. The idea of cooperating with a stranger, yeah, I mean, it's a little unusual. You're not doing that. But look at us, now in the United States, for instance, like how many people do I interact with that I'm never going to see again and I don't know their name of? Like the modal person that I see is probably someone I don't know. And so this is, I think some necessary shifts had to take place for us to be able to live in and accommodate a society where we're constantly interacting with strangers. And I think it's cool to be able to capture that in these little, social preference tests. Like we really do find that even early on, especially in this period of development, which we talked about being so important, you're already seeing the emergence of this type of normative behavior and these normative judgments that are fine-tuned to the social environment that you're being raised in.
Do you know of any research on spontaneous emergence of these market dynamics in children? Because like on one hand, you could say that complicated trade networks and using currency and things like that are all like very complicated and probably have to be learned. But on the other hand, there's sort of the trope of like children trading candy on the playground. And it seems like something that emerges very organically.
Yeah, the idea of trade, for instance.
Yes.
Yeah, no, it does. It certainly does. And I think there's an entirely other conversation we can have about children's culture, which I think is fascinating. So like, what are kids doing among themselves? Which I think is a really like understudied form of cultural evolution even. Yes, I think they do emerge spontaneously. And there is a question also, and you just raised this, like how much of what they're doing and how they're behaving is shaped by what people are telling them is the normative behavior or what they're observing among adults versus just like what is a reasonable behavior given the statistics of the environment that they engage in, right? Mm-hmm. It's tough. It's hard because those are often confounded, right? Because the environment that the kids are experiencing is also likely the environment that the adults are experiencing. And the incentive structure of that environment might push you toward, let's say, cooperating with a stranger. And so you might have convergent development of both of those things at both of these age groups for either the same or both reasons, right? So I think it's a little hard to pin down, is it a child engaging with the environment, that's why that behavior is being produced, versus is it because there's cultural information being passed down? It's messy, right? And like the environment is also shaping the culture, which is shaping the adults' behavior, which is shaping the kids' behavior. Like there's a lot of dialogue between all these different pieces.
Have you done any research on that yourself, on the children's culture?
Yeah, so this is something, so I'm hoping to do more research on this because I think it's just so fascinating, actually. But, and I'll just make this point now. I think there's a tendency to think of kids as like passive recipients of adult culture. They're kind of like spectators and they're little receptacles waiting to be filled with our knowledge. And I think that actually reveals, like, again, the biases that a typical researcher has, right? So in general, when you're thinking about these things, the research that's being done is being done by adults, right? And they're really interested in what adults do and how adults think and how adults behave. In the same way that like a human researcher investigating like animal intelligence is likely to think like, oh, is this animal as smart as humans? Let's give them a test that humans can solve and see if they can solve it. Like there is this benchmark that you're comparing against, which is influenced by who you as the researcher are. And I think because of that, there's been very little appreciation for children's own culture as like not only just something that's interesting and independent, but something that's actually really informative and important in shaping the next generation of culture. I think people really, really undervalue how cool that is. It's kind of like when a child is learning language, they're not just like passively accepting the language you give them. They're almost like reinventing language every generation and acquiring the bits and pieces from their environment, but they're like creating it. So this is how like, pidgin languages become Creole languages, because as you're entering the world and learning language, you're actually like reinventing it. And I think the same thing is happening with culture. I don't think I'm just like this high fidelity transmission from adult to kid, and I'm just like, okay, like now I've filled up enough knowledge to be an adult. I think that's a very adult centric view of the world. And I think that's really, underselling the active role that kids have in creating culture. And what's cool also is like children's culture. So I don't know, like a simple example of this is like a playground game. That is children inventing culture for other children. And it's actually passed down child to child, maybe sibling to sibling, for generations. It has all the same hallmarks of cumulative cultural evolution that you see with adults. But it's really not, I think, valued as such. And I think that's a mistake.
So two optimistic and pessimistic extremes on like innate childhood behavior. The optimistic one would be something like children are fundamentally good-hearted and they don't have discrimination or things like that. And that just happens once they're corrupted by society. And the pessimistic extreme would be something like Lord of the Flies, where it's like without rules and stability, children are going to be violent and everything's going to turn into chaos. It's probably somewhere in the middle. Do you know of any anthropological evidence that shifts one way or the other?
I think the behavior we should expect of kids is the same thing that we should expect of adults, which is that it's really, really sensitive to the structure of the environment. So what are the things that are incentivized? What are the things that are rewarded? What are the things that are punished? Like, what are the successful strategies in this environment? That's going to determine what ends up happening. Humans are extremely sensitive to incentive structures. And this is what culture provides, right? And so this is why you get so much diversity in all these different behaviors across these different cultures and societies, because they have different incentive structures. So I would say neither. They're not inherently good or inherently bad. They're inherently responsive, I would say.
How about sex differences being explained by different cultural incentive structures? Because on one hand, there's the nature side. This is what my own research focuses on, like how hormones during puberty influence reward sensitivity and stuff like that. And males tend to be more impulsive. And there seem to be biological reasons for that, but also probably socialized reasons for that. Could you fill in more on that anthropological?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I agree with you. I mean, I think it's almost certainly a combination of both things, right? So, and all this to say, by the way, when I say, we're responsive to the incentive structure, that doesn't mean that I'm not a blank slatist. I don't think that we're literally just like, classically conditioning our way through the world. Like, it is obviously going to be a combination of these kind of innate maybe predispositions or a range of behaviors that you can accommodate, and that's responding to the incentive structure of the world. And I think that a very similar thing is going on probably with sex and gender differences. There's plasticity, of course, right, in how something is expressed, and I think this goes back to just like gene and environment. There is a range of ways in which this gene can be expressed. There's a range of ways in which like gender can be expressed, and you kind of accommodate whatever the world is telling you is acceptable. And I think, but what's interesting about the human story, again, is that we have this additional thing of culture. So it's not just us and the environment, there's also the cultural environment. And the cultural environment is also being shaped by, like it's not free of biology, like it is biology. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And so there's this kind of cycle between our expression of our genes, the cultural expression of various phenotypes, and that's all interacting with each other. So the short answer is both. Like, surely there is some interaction between innate capabilities and the incentive structure of the environment. Yeah.
How does it change cross-culturally? Like most of the sex differences I'm aware of really start to kick off at puberty, because like children, prepubescent children are a lot more similar, males and females. But I'm not sure to what extent that's similar or dissimilar across different cultures.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I will point you toward a paper that will summarize this better than I do by Shayna Levy and colleagues called How Do Hunter-Gatherers Learn Gender Norms? And it is a meta-ethnographic review of various ethnographies, and it details kind of how children learn to take on the gender roles and responsibilities of their culture. And what you see is a lot of actually gradual change. So it's not necessarily that it's all the same. And then right at puberty, it starts diverging. Actually, at pretty young ages, for instance, in a lot of these societies, kids are already kind of self-segregating into these same-sex play groups. And they are attending more to, for instance, a child will attend a bit more to a female partner or a female caregiver, and they start doing that pretty early on. But of course, it's hard to say. It's, again, this kind of like snake eating its own tail thing, right? Because it's not like they're completely agentic and able to do exactly what they want. They are being shaped by the environment that they're entering into, and there might be explicit or implicit ways in which we're pushing them toward those things. But you do see, for instance, that like depending on, so for instance, I think if I'm remembering this correctly, and I'm sorry, Shayna, if I'm missummarizing this, but so for instance, among the Hadza, which has much more sex-specific labor, so from a pretty early age, kids start to diverge into their gender groups, and they start to take on the roles and active labor of those genders, which is different, much more different than among like the Aka or the Bayaka, who are doing a lot more overlapping labor. And so depending on what the, expectations are for an adult, male or female in that society, or there are, of course, societies that have different genders, they have multiple genders. And I think that's another thing that's very interesting, and again, speaks to this like interaction between this, more innate disposition, something like sexual orientation, and what's possible in the society that you live in, right? So what will it accommodate? And of course, that's going to determine maybe what you feel comfortable or safe exploring or expressing.
That's very interesting. Dorsa, what are you looking forward to most in your current or future research?
Oh, that's an interesting question. Well, I have some data that just came in that I'm really interested in exploring that I haven't done yet. So a lot of the work that I've been doing has been about things like risk preferences, so how people respond to uncertainty. And I'm really curious about how that develops. And how different types of uncertainty are explored. So I have this fresh data that just came in. I can't wait to look at it. Came in this morning from my collaborators in Iran, looking at cross-cultural differences and how people respond to different kinds of uncertainty. So in this case, we're looking at the difference between what we call epistemic uncertainty and physical uncertainty. So imagine I have a dice and I'm going to roll it. I haven't rolled it yet. That's physical uncertainty because nothing has happened yet. It could take many forms. And then imagine I've rolled it, but it's behind an occluder. You don't know what number it landed on. That's what we call epistemic uncertainty. So it has already happened, but you don't have knowledge of the outcome. And so I'm really curious to know, are there regularities and how averse we are to one type over the other? So that's like a very proximate, like, I can't wait to analyze that data literally today. More broadly, I've really been really interested in this idea. This is my like pie in the sky project that I like keep trying to get funding for and failing. But this idea that uncertainty is necessarily bad, right? So there is this tendency to think of like randomness or unpredictability as being bad. We don't like that. There's a lot of evolutionary adaptations to reduce that in the world. But actually, there are some benefits to being unpredictable or random or uncertain, right? So you want to be unpredictable to others, maybe, but you want to be able to predict others sometimes when it behooves you to do so. And so we've designed a series of experiments looking at what we call strategic randomness. So the positive roles that unpredictability can have and what domains that really seems to play a role in. So that's something I'm really interested in and thinking a lot about recently.
Sam Gershman here at Harvard, I think,
Oh yeah,
doing
Sam
a
talked
lot to do
about
with
this,
that,
yeah.
with like the computational cognitive models and when is uncertainty adaptive and all these things.
Yes, exactly. And there's also another paper, I think, by a philosopher called Why Be Random, which I thought was really good, about the various ways. So like one of the examples is that let's say you're like in a predator-prey relationship, if they match you, like they go to the spot you're at and the predator matches you, like you're screwed. So you're constantly trying to predict what they're going to do and then going the opposite direction. And so in those scenarios, actually it's called a mixed strategy Nash equilibria. So you have in these scenarios, it's actually, I think the economic game is called matching pennies. The best behavior is one that randomly chooses between two things.
Right.
Because
Same in rock, paper, scissors.
exactly. Uh, there are, that's a really clever way to, like, if you don't even know where you're going to go, that's a really
Yeah.
good way to be unpredictable. So I'm thinking a lot about, domains in which uncertainty and randomness are actually preserved because it might provide some sort of adaptive or beneficial outcome. So
one last big idea that I want to get your thoughts on. So it seems like a lot of your work is pushing back against this weird notion that's like the default. But it also seems now, at least in my mind, I've been framing this as, okay, we have the weird nations as one anchor point, and then we have at the other extreme hunter-gatherers, and then in the middle you have like other societies.
Yeah.
But that also is probably not a great way to conceptualize it, right? Where you have these two anchors.
Yeah. So I will say the weird notion is a really helpful rhetorical device. And I think it succeeded in that, like, it was catchy and compelling and easy to understand. And it was a call to action ultimately, right? So Joe's paper was fundamentally saying this is a sampling bias that we have. It really is like preventing us from understanding the full spectrum of diversity. There are better ways to classify differences between communities and between societies. And actually, I think Michael Muthakrishna has a tool out. It's a paper, and then there's an online tool that measures what's called cultural distance. So in the same way that you might measure genetic distance, you can do it with cultures on various dimensions, which is really cool. So it's no longer looking at like weird versus non-weird. Now it's very specifically like, okay, between these two populations. So what are
then you have to come up with the dimensions. That seems like
exactly. Yeah, I mean, it's chaotic, right? Like there's a lot going on. But that's also what's really cool, I think, about different cultures. Like, I don't think anyone would disagree that the culture that you're raised in is deeply, deeply important in shaping who you end up being, right? Like how what you pay attention to, how you speak, your likes, your dislikes, food preferences, music preferences, like anything really that we care about, we would say is intimately linked to the culture that you were raised in. It's one of the most important things, actually, in terms of like when you're born into something, what culture are you born into seems to be one of the most like consequential variables. But it's made up of so many things and it's so difficult to study. So it's simultaneously like very challenging to study, but also like deeply consequential. So whatever headway I think we make is going to be worthwhile. And we just have to study it. I think that's the thing. Like we can't ignore it because it's hard to study. And this is often a point that I make because like, there's no culture-free human. Like you studying Californian preschoolers that live near UC Berkeley, that's great, but it's not like they're free of culture. You're studying Americans, right? And I think this is at least something that we need to get more comfortable saying and acknowledging, that there's no generic human. And we have a lot of information and decades of insight into like Americans, but we can't just assume that that's the standard human. And almost everything that we know really needs to be pressure tested about its generalizability, because it's unless you have the data, you really can't make that claim.
In using this cross-cultural perspective, are you more excited at identifying different places that we diverge, or are you more motivated by seeing what remains the same across cultures?
I think they're both so interesting, actually. So there was this recent paper, for instance, that we did with Sam Mayer, looking at acoustic regularities in infant song, for instance, where we brought together like dozens of researchers from dozens.
Courtney Hilton was on that as well, right?
Courtney Hilton, I think, was actually the first author. I'm so sorry for not mentioning him. And Cody Moser was the joint first author. But that was a really, I think, very cool way to assess this generalizability question and actually ultimately find that there's a lot of regularities in how, for instance, infant speech and infant song are produced. Like fascinating, really interesting. That likely points to, this shared point in the past. And, there is divergence rather than convergence. And also, I think that the reverse is just as interesting, right? Like, what are the things that are susceptible to cultural input, and what are the things that we should expect to vary? And we just like have never actually studied it outside of one context. There's like decades and decades of research that can be done on this.
So that's the epistemic uncertainty that we have.
Yeah, exactly. Right? That's such a good, I like that.
Thank you very much for your time, Dorsa.
Of course, yeah, this is really fun. Thanks.